Picture the desert at night. The air cooling fast after the sun's retreat, and the faint rustle of wind across sand that has been here far longer than any human memory. Somewhere beneath your feet, beneath the drifting dunes and the cracked limestone, the bones of a story are waiting. A story that whispers through the weathered face of the Sphinx, through erosion patterns that shouldn't exist in a desert this dry, through stones that may remember a world we've only begun to imagine. We have been told for generations that the pyramids of Giza rose around 4,500 years ago, under the rule of kings whose names are still carved into temple walls. But what if that story is only the final act of a much older tale? What if these colossal shapes were already ancient when the first hieroglyph was scratched into stone? What if the Sphinx, with its water-worn walls and enigmatic gaze, has been watching this desert far longer than any pharaoh ever reigned? You might already be picturing stonecutters in white linen skirts, the sun blazing down oxen pulling sledges. But imagine something stranger. Imagine something that challenges everything we think we know about the birth of civilization. Imagine the same scene, except the air is cooler, the Nile is wider, and the horizon is dotted not with sand, but with patches of grass and scattered trees. Imagine rain falling steadily on the Giza plateau, pooling around the base of monuments already centuries old. Imagine the Sphinx not in the desert we know, but standing guard over a green valley, where water flows and life thrives. Somewhere far away, ice sheets the size of continents grind slowly toward the sea. It's not the Egypt you learned about in school. This is Egypt, before pharaohs had names, before the desert swallowed the green. This is a world the Sphinx might actually remember. In recent decades, a handful of geologists and historians have looked at the Giza Plateau and noticed things that don't quite fit the official narrative. The limestone enclosure around the Great Sphinx, for example, is weathered in a way that suggests it has endured centuries of heavy rainfall. Rainfall that hasn't been common in this part of the world for at least 7,000 years, possibly much longer. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, famously argued in the 1990s that the Sphinx could be much older than dynastic Egypt, possibly dating back to the end of the last ice age when this desert was still green. Mainstream Egyptologists pushed back hard, pointing out the lack of artifacts or inscriptions to support such a date. Historians are still debating whether these erosion patterns are the fingerprints of an ancient climate, or simply the result of wind and sand over time. But the stone itself doesn't lie, and if you know how to read it, the story it tells is far older than we've been willing to admit. It's an odd thing to consider, especially when you realize how much of history rests on the assumption that human civilization is relatively young. Most textbooks start the story of advanced humanity around 5,000 years ago, with the rise of city-states and organized agriculture. But every so often, an artifact or a ruin slips into view and seems to whisper quietly but insistently that we might have overlooked something. Think of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a complex of massive carved stones erected 11,600 years ago, long before the supposed invention of agriculture. Its existence doesn't prove that the pyramids are older than we think, but it does remind us that humans were shaping stone with remarkable skill deep into prehistory. If they could build Göbekli Tepe before farming, before cities, before writing, what else might they have been capable of? There's a strange comfort in the official story. It's neat, it's chronological, and it fits well with what's already in museums. But the human mind has a weakness for neatness. It prefers smooth surfaces to rough edges, and history, real history, is full of rough edges. If you stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and run your fingers over its weathered blocks. You're touching stone that was ancient, even in the age of Homer. Those stones have been rained on, baked, shaken by earthquakes, and brushed by the hands of countless pilgrims, scholars, and looters. They've seen the stars shift in the night sky, the desert expand and contract, and the Nile change its course. And the Sphinx has watched it all with those weathered eyes, seeing everything, remembering everything. In the only language stone knows, the language of erosion and endurance and time. Odd fact: in 2013, archaeologists in the Egyptian desert uncovered a complete Roman-era ship buried hundreds of miles from the sea. A reminder that what lies beneath the sand isn't always what we expect. And if a ship can survive in the desert for nearly 2,000 years, why couldn't something far older, an earlier layer of the pyramids themselves, perhaps even the Sphinx's original face, be waiting under those limestone blocks? The challenge is that stone is both patient and deceptive. A block of weathered limestone might be 20 years old, or 20,000. And unless it carries an inscription, the truth can be hard to pin down. That's part of what makes the Ice Age theory so tantalizing. It offers an older, messier history, one that doesn't fit neatly into the boxes of dynastic timelines. But it also leaves us with vast empty spaces where certainty should be. And in those spaces, imagination starts to take root. Questions start to echo. What if the Sphinx really does remember? What if those erosion patterns are memory, carved in stone? What if we've been standing in front of the answer all along, without knowing how to read it? So, before you settle in for this journey through time, take a moment to subscribe if you'd like to join me on more explorations like this. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you right now? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment with your location or your time zone, or just the word "here" to let me know you're out there, somewhere under your own patch of night sky listening to this same story. There's something profound about knowing we're scattered across the globe yet connected by the same questions, about the same ancient stones. And if you're enjoying what you're hearing, a simple like helps this story find others who might appreciate it too. Now let's continue. As you think about that picture, the pyramids, not as the crowning achievement of a young civilization, but as something inherited, something that stood silent for centuries, perhaps millennia, before being claimed by the pharaohs we know by name. Imagine them as survivors, their sharp edges dulled by thousands of years of wind and rain, before the Old Kingdom even began. Imagine the Sphinx not as the guardian built by Khafre, but as the witness who watched Khafre's masons reshape its weathered face to match their king. You don't have to believe it. You only have to let the possibility drift across your mind like a thin cloud over a bright moon. After all, history is not only what happened, it's also what we're willing to consider. And tonight, we're going to consider something that the Sphinx might remember, if stone could speak. We're going to trace the scars on its face and ask what story they tell. We're going to imagine Egypt not in the desert heat we know, but in a time when rain fell and the land was green, and the Ice Age was just beginning to release its grip on the world. We're going to ask, what if the Sphinx remembers the Ice Age? And what if the answer changes everything we thought we knew? Chapter 1. The Trace of Water. If you have only ever known Egypt through photographs, documentaries, or perhaps a single visit in the height of summer, You might believe this land has always been dry. The kind of dryness that draws lines across your lips that makes your eyes ache under the sun's glare. The Giza Plateau, with its beige expanse and its colossal monuments, seems to belong to a world utterly removed from the gentleness of rain. Yet if you trace the scars on its stones, you might begin to suspect that water once had a much more intimate conversation with this landscape. The Great Sphinx, guardian of the plateau, is the most eloquent witness. Its massive lion's body and human face are carved directly into the bedrock, and around it lies an enclosure, walls of limestone whose surfaces tell a story no inscription records. These walls are etched with deep vertical channels, grooves that curl and smooth as they descend, the kind of shapes that moving water tends to leave behind. Geologists who study erosion patterns have learned to distinguish the signature of wind from that of rain. Wind erosion is horizontal, sharp-edged, like a blade scraping in one direction. Water, by contrast, softens. It curls its way down, wearing pockets and folds, creating a kind of rippling effect in the stone. Robert Schoch, a Boston University geologist, first made international headlines in the 1990s by suggesting that these patterns could not have been made by mere centuries of wind and sand. In his view, they spoke of centuries of heavy rainfall. Rainfall of the kind that has not been common here for at least 7,000 years. Schoch's conclusion was bold. If the Sphinx's enclosure showed signs of water erosion, then the monument must have been carved long before the time of Pharaoh Khafre, perhaps even before the end of the last ice age, when the Sahara was a land of grass and rivers. This idea met fierce resistance from Egyptologists, whose timeline for the Sphinx was anchored in archaeological evidence from the Old Kingdom. The argument went like this. The Sphinx resembles the face of Khafre's statues. It sits next to his pyramid complex, and the surrounding temples use limestone blocks quarried from the very pit in which the Sphinx rests. Therefore, the most logical explanation is that Khafre ordered its construction around 2500 BCE. Any erosion, they said, could be the result of wind, sand, or even the occasional flood caused by rising groundwater in ancient times. Historians are still debating whether the weathering is a clue to a much earlier origin or simply a byproduct of later natural forces. The truth is frustratingly slippery. Stone holds its age in ways that resist easy measurement. Dating it is not like dating a piece of wood or bone with radiocarbon techniques. Without an inscription saying "carved in the year 10", the argument must rely on interpretation. Geology versus archaeology. Climate science versus cultural context. To complicate matters further, the Sphinx is not the only structure with puzzling erosion. Nearby blocks from the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple, massive limestone and granite constructions show similar weathering, and in some cases, erosion more severe than that on the Sphinx itself. Some have proposed that these temples, too, were originally built, or at least begun, in a wetter era, and only later incorporated into the grand design of the Old Kingdom. Understanding how such an era could exist here means stepping back into deep time. Imagine the end of the last ice age, between 12,000 and 9,000 years ago. The polar ice caps and glaciers were melting rapidly, pouring fresh water into the oceans, altering global wind and rainfall patterns. In North Africa, this was the African humid period, a time when monsoon rains reached far north into the Sahara. Vast lakes formed where there is now only sand. The Nile swelled with seasonal floods, far greater than anything in recorded history. and the surrounding land bloomed. If a monument had been cut into limestone during this era, it would have endured years, perhaps succession, of seasonal soaking. This paints a very different picture from the Egypt you know. Picture yourself standing before the Sphinx. Then the air smells of wet soil and crushed leaves. The nearby plateau is dotted with pools left by recent rains, and somewhere in the distance, a waterfall tumbles into a rocky basin. An almost unthinkable image in modern Giza. The Sphinx itself, freshly carved or already centuries old, drips with water, its flanks darkened by the storm. Odd fact, even in the hyper-arid modern Sahara, sudden downpours still happen, and they can be catastrophic. In 1975, a rare storm in Algeria dumped so much water in a single day that rivers formed where none had existed for decades. It's not hard to imagine that in a greener age, those rivers and rains could persist for months on end, gradually shaping any exposed rock. If the Sphinx truly predates the Old Kingdom, it would mean that the pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty inherited not just land, but monumental architecture already centuries or millennia old. They might have restored it, reshaped it, or even recarved its face to resemble their own rulers. Later construction could have obscured the fact that they were working with something far older, something left by a people we can barely imagine. The stakes of this debate are more than just academic. If proven true, it would extend the history of monumental architecture in Egypt by thousands of years, placing its beginnings in a time when human society, according to mainstream history, should have been far less capable of such feats. It would challenge the very timeline we've built for human civilization, forcing us to admit that advanced building techniques might have been known and then forgotten, long before written history began. And yet, here is where the patience of stone meets the impatience of humans. The Sphinx will not tell us when it was carved. The grooves in its enclosure will not whisper the century in which they were formed. They are simply there, mute but insistent, daring us to match their story with our own understanding of the past. As the desert wind brushes over the plateau, carrying with it the dry scent of dust, it's almost possible to hear the echoes of that long goodbye. The retreat of the rains, the slow fading of rivers, the transformation of a green land into a golden one. That transformation, more than any war or king or dynasty, might have been the true turning point in Egypt's history. It set the stage for the desert we know today, and for the mysteries that still stand upon it. Chapter 2. The Nameless Builders. Strip away the hieroglyphs, the royal cartouches, and the carved images of pharaohs offering incense to the gods, and what remains is the raw, silent geometry of stone. The blocks do not tell you who placed them. They do not lean toward one dynasty or another. They simply exist, indifferent to the centuries of stories layered upon them. And if we could step far enough back in time, far beyond the Old Kingdom, beyond the emergence of writing, beyond the moment when Egypt was even a concept, we might find ourselves face to face with the makers of those stones. Makers whose names have been erased, not by malice, but by time itself. It is difficult to imagine Egypt without its pharaohs. Their faces and titles dominate the monuments as though they had always been here. But what if the earliest great works along the Nile predate kings entirely? What if, before there was a Narmer to unify Upper and Lower Egypt, there was already an architectural tradition, one with no inscriptions, no record we can read, but a clear and deliberate sense of design? Such a thought can be unsettling, because it challenges our neat progression of history, the tidy ladder of complexity that we like to think all civilizations climb. Consider Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Discovered in the 1990s, it consists of massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, carved with reliefs of animals, foxes, boars, cranes, scorpions. Some of these stones weigh up to 20 tons, yet they were shaped and set in place by a society that, as far as we know, had no cities, no pottery, no writing. It dates back to around 9600 BCE, thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands of years before the earliest known temples in Mesopotamia. Göbekli Tepe forces us to abandon the assumption that complex architecture must follow complex political structures. People, without kings, without armies, without bureaucracies, still found reasons and ways to move mountains of stone. It raises a tantalizing question. If this could happen on the Anatolian plateau at the dawn of the Holocene, why not on the fertile banks of a wetter, wilder Nile? Imagine a community there long before the pharaohs. The river runs higher and broader than today, flanked by forests and marshes. Small villages of reed houses cluster along the banks, their inhabitants fishing, hunting, and perhaps tending early gardens. Knowledge travels with traders and wanderers, passed not through parchment, but through memory and repetition. Over time, a shared ambition takes root to create something that will outlast them all. It would not have been a tomb, not in the sense the Old Kingdom pyramids were. Without written language, they had no way to leave behind the name of a king or the details of his reign. Perhaps it was a ceremonial platform, a star marker, a place where the community gathered to speak with their gods or honor their dead. We do not know, and perhaps never will. But they would have understood stone's stubbornness, how it resists the decay that claims wood and clay. If you want your voice to carry forward into ages you cannot imagine, you speak in stone. Odd fact: the world's oldest known musical instrument is a flute, made from the wing bone of a vulture found in a cave in Germany. It is over 40,000 years old, and it still plays. Human beings have always tried to make beauty last, whether in sound, pigment, or stone. The impulse to build something enduring is as old as the impulse to sing. If these early Nile builders left no inscriptions, what traces would survive? The stones themselves, worn but still standing, could be incorporated into later works. A future people, one with kings, scribes, and armies, might find these great shapes already waiting and decide to claim them, to add their own flourishes, to wrap them in the iconography of their own age. In that way, the origin of the structure could be obscured, buried under layers of later history. Historians are still debating whether any part of the Giza complex predates the Fourth Dynasty. The mainstream view is that the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the associated temples are products of that period alone. Yet the very nature of monumental building invites reuse. The Romans built amphitheaters on Etruscan foundations. Medieval cathedrals were raised on the ruins of Roman temples. There is precedent for such layering everywhere we look. Why not here? Picture yourself at dawn, standing on the plateau in that earlier age. The horizon is pale gold, and mist curls off the river below. Around you, people move with deliberate purpose, carrying baskets of stone chips, guiding sledges laden with blocks, shouting to each other over the rhythmic thud of tools on rock. You notice the absence of ornament. No carved royal faces, no proclamations of power. This is architecture stripped of ego, devoted to something we can no longer name. Over the centuries, the people who built it vanish. Their language fades. Their villages crumble. Their beliefs dissolve into fragments. The stone remains patient and silent. Then, thousands of years later, the first pharaohs arrive. They inherit a landscape already marked by mystery, and they do what rulers often do. They fold it into their story. They restore, they reshape, and in some cases they recarve. Perhaps the Sphinx once wore a different face before Khafre's masons gave it his own. Perhaps the core of a pyramid stood for centuries before the casing stones went on. We can't prove it, but the possibility is enough to keep the question alive. And in that space between proof and possibility lies the wonder that keeps us looking at the stones, at the stars, and at the faint traces of people whose names were never written, but whose hands may still be felt in the weight of the ancient blocks. Stand close to the base of a pyramid, not the white gleaming sides you've seen in artists' reconstructions, but the raw, ancient blocks of its exposed core. The sun catches on their edges, revealing a mottled surface of pale cream and rusty brown. You might notice something curious. Not all the blocks look the same. Some are fitted with almost impossible precision, their seams barely visible. Others are irregular, their edges chipped, the surfaces rough. And scattered among them are marks, grooves, chisel lines, circular impressions that don't seem to match the simple copper tools the Old Kingdom masons are said to have used. This is the puzzle of the stonecutters of a forgotten age, if such an age existed. The official story tells us that the Great Pyramid, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, was the product of thousands of laborers using copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, and wooden sledges. Limestone was cut from local quarries, granite from faraway Aswan, and everything was hauled into place through the brute force of human effort. And yes, copper is capable of cutting limestone, given enough time and determination. But then you encounter granite, dense, unyielding, with a hardness far beyond copper's ability to scratch. The granite used in the Great Pyramid's inner chambers weighs between 25 and 80 tons per block, and it was shaped to exact dimensions. Some of these blocks are polished so smooth that even today, cutting them with such accuracy would require diamond-tipped tools or industrial saws. In other places, like the so-called King's Chamber, the granite beams overhead span the entire room, each weighing more than a loaded railway car. It's hard to reconcile this with the image of men pounding away at stone for years with handheld dolerite balls. When explorers first entered the pyramids in the modern era, they noticed something even stranger. Some granite surfaces bore marks of long, shallow cuts, as if a saw blade had passed cleanly through them. Others contained circular drill holes, some as much as several inches deep, with spiral grooves inside. To modern engineers, those grooves suggest a high-speed rotary drill, something capable of applying consistent pressure as it turns. Experimental archaeology has shown that copper tube drills with sand as an abrasive can produce similar holes, but the process is painfully slow, and the spiral grooves produced in experiments don't quite match the ancient examples. Historians are still debating whether these marks are simply the product of skilled, patient work with the tools of the time, or evidence of techniques and materials that have since been lost. If they are the latter, then the question arises, who developed them and when? Could there have been earlier builders, perhaps long before the Old Kingdom, who passed on some of their methods, or whose abandoned blocks and cut stones were later reused by Khufu's masons? Odd fact, In 1837, Colonel Howard Vyse, an English soldier and antiquarian, discovered red-painted quarry marks in hidden chambers above the king's chamber. These marks contain the name of Khufu, and they were taken as final proof that the pyramid belonged to him. Yet Vyse's methods have been questioned for decades, with some even suggesting the possibility of a 19th century forgery. Whether genuine or not, the marks tell us one thing: the assignment of ownership in archaeology often rests on fragile evidence, and our confidence in dating a monument can hinge on a single painted cartouche. The possibility of stone reuse complicates the picture. Across Egypt, archaeologists have found instances of later rulers dismantling older structures to build new ones, sometimes erasing the original inscriptions, sometimes leaving them visible as faint ghosts under fresh carvings. If this happened on the Giza plateau, then some of the blocks we now associate with the Fourth Dynasty could be far older. And unlike an inscription, stone offers no clue about when it was first cut. The sheer logistics of working with such massive blocks suggest a mastery of quarrying and transport that even the Old Kingdom's sophisticated bureaucracy would have struggled to match. In Aswan, unfinished obelisks and half-cut granite blocks still lie in their quarries, bearing the marks of their makers. Some show fractures where the stone split unexpectedly. Others are perfectly shaped, but never moved. The unfinished obelisk, over 1,000 tons in weight, was abandoned after cracks appeared during cutting. The fact that workers were even attempting to carve something that large hints at either astonishing ambition or a long tradition of moving megaliths that they inherited from earlier generations. Imagine the scene in that possible earlier age. The tools might not look like anything we recognize today. Perhaps they were still made of stone, but used in ways we no longer understand. Perhaps they had discovered ways to soften certain rocks chemically, making cutting easier. A theory occasionally floated in fringe archaeology, though never proven. Or perhaps they had mechanical devices, simple but effective, that multiplied human strength without the complexity of modern engines. Whatever they used, the results were enduring. Blocks so precisely shaped that 4,000 years of weather and earthquakes have failed to break their joins. It's worth remembering that advanced technology doesn't have to mean something out of a science fiction film. The ancient world often solved problems with clever, low-tech innovations that we overlook because they seem too simple. The Roman concrete formula, lost for centuries, produced structures that still stand today, while many modern equivalents crumble within decades. Polynesian navigators could cross thousands of miles of open ocean without a compass, using only the stars, waves, and the flight of birds. The stonecutters of Giza, whether Old Kingdom Egyptians or someone earlier, may have had their own suite of lost techniques, developed slowly, handed down through generations, and then forgotten. Odd fact, in some parts of Egypt, particularly around old quarry sites, ancient tool marks remain on rock faces that were abandoned mid-cut. Some of these marks suggest a scooping method, where large chunks of stone were carved out in a continuous curve, something that's hard to replicate with pounding stones alone. Walking among the pyramids today, you can still see the evidence of human hands in every surface. The precision varies from block to block, hinting that some may indeed have come from different periods or been made by different teams with different skills. In the shadow of the pyramid, it's not difficult to imagine those earlier stonecutters, anonymous now, shaping the first great blocks of Giza, their sweat and breath mingling with the dust. Their work, destined to be claimed by others. And so, the puzzle remains. Are these marks, these blocks, these improbable feats of shaping and moving stone, purely the work of Old Kingdom Egyptians? Or are they the legacy of a much older chapter in Egypt's story? The stone is silent, but it holds the possibility in every chisel line, every drill hole, every impossible fit. And if you place your hand on its surface, feeling the warmth fade into coolness as the sun sets, you might sense not answers, but the echo of the hands that came before. Chapter 3. The Ice Age World. If you could peel back the layers of time and stand here on the Giza Plateau 20,000 years ago, the air would feel different on your skin. The sun would still be warm during the day, but the nights would be sharper, colder. You might glance north and see a sky heavy with clouds, a rarity in modern Egypt. And if you could step beyond this narrow valley, you'd find a planet caught in the grip of the last ice age. During the last glacial maximum, enormous ice sheets blanketed North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia, locking away vast quantities of the planet's water. Sea levels were over 100 meters lower than they are today. The outlines of continents were different. Islands, now separated by wide channels, were once connected by broad plains. In the Mediterranean, coastlines stretched far beyond their modern boundaries, and the Nile Delta, now a flat fan of fertile land, would have extended much farther into the sea. Although Egypt itself was too far south for glaciers, it felt the Ice Age's influence in other ways. The atmosphere was drier in some periods, wetter in others, as global wind and rain patterns shifted. There were years when the monsoons reached farther north, feeding the Nile with a richer flow, and other times when the rains retreated and the river ran thinner. The Sahara, too, was not yet the unbroken expanse of sand we see today. Pockets of grassland and steppe dotted the landscape, interspersed with rocky highlands and seasonal watercourses. Odd fact, while humans in the Nile Valley may have been adapting to these changes, woolly mammoths were still roaming far away in Siberia and North America. In fact, some mammoths survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until about 4,000 years ago, meaning there were still mammoths on Earth at the same time the Great Pyramid was supposedly being built. The overlap of such vastly different worlds is one of history's quiet wonders. If an advanced culture existed in the Nile Valley during the Ice Age, they would have faced a landscape in constant flux. The river might have shifted its course more often than in later times. Its floodplains could have been more expansive in wet years, retreating in dry ones. The people living here would have needed to adapt, constantly moving their settlements, changing their hunting and farming practices, perhaps learning to navigate waterways that no longer exist today. Now imagine that during one of the more stable climatic windows, when the rains were dependable and the Nile's flow steady, this culture decided to build something enduring. They might not have thought of it in the same way the pharaohs did. Instead of a tomb for a single ruler, perhaps it was a communal monument, a place for ceremonies tied to the cycles of nature, the stars, or the river. They might have chosen the Giza Plateau not just for its elevation, which kept it safe from floods, but for its position relative to celestial markers. When the climate shifted again, the consequences would have been devastating. Around 12,900 years ago, the world plunged into the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. Temperatures dropped rapidly, rainfall patterns changed abruptly, and many large animal species went extinct. In North America, the megafauna vanished. In the Nile Valley, plant and animal communities would have been transformed. If a civilization had thrived here before this event, they might have been scattered or even erased by the changing environment. Historians are still debating whether human societies of that era were capable of building on the scale of the pyramids. Mainstream archaeology says no, pointing out that agriculture, metallurgy, and large-scale social organization are not evident in the archaeological record before about 6000 BCE in Egypt. Yet there are anomalies. Structures like Göbekli Tepe prove that large, organized labor forces could exist among non-agricultural peoples, Stone circles at Nabta deep in the Egyptian desert, are aligned to the stars and date back as far as 7,000 years ago, hinting at an astronomical awareness older than the pyramids themselves. Odd fact, if you could have stood at the Giza Plateau in the late Pleistocene, you might have looked west across the Sahara and seen distant mountains capped with seasonal snow. It's not an image we associate with Africa, but in colder times, snow in the highlands of the Maghreb was more common. If monumental structures existed here before the end of the Ice Age, the melting of the great ice sheets and the accompanying rise in sea levels could have hidden much of their supporting evidence. The Nile Delta in particular would have been inundated as the seas rose, potentially burying entire settlements and smaller monuments beneath the waters of the Mediterranean. The Giza Plateau, safely inland and elevated, might have been one of the few places where the largest constructions could survive unscathed. Picture those earlier builders watching the slow transformation of their world. Perhaps they saw the Nile's floodplain shrink, the green retreating toward the riverbanks. Perhaps they noticed the air growing warmer year by year, the storms changing in character, the migratory birds arriving at different times. And perhaps they told their children to remember, not just the changes they were living through, but the structures they had built. Maybe they believed that one day, someone would stand here again and understand. By the time the Old Kingdom emerged, the Ice Age was long over. The pharaohs inherited a Nile that was calmer, more predictable. But if the Giza Plateau already held monumental stonework by then, it would have been an irresistible prize, ready to be claimed, reshaped, and folded into the narrative of divine kingship. That possibility changes the way we see the pyramids. They might not just be symbols of the Old Kingdom's power, but survivors from a time when the planet itself looked and felt very different. A time when ice and thaw dictated the shape of continents, and human cultures rose and fell in step with the great climatic pulse of the Earth. And so, when you stand at Giza today and feel the dry wind on your face, you might also feel, faintly, the ghost of that ancient chill. The air carries no ice crystals now, but the stones remember. Before the Age of Kings, before cities rose from mud brick, before the first hieroglyph was carved into stone, there were stories. Stories passed from mouth to mouth over campfires on riverbanks and in the quiet hours before dawn. Among the oldest of these stories, in nearly every culture that survived into recorded history, is a tale about water. Not the gentle seasonal floods that farmers love, but an overwhelming, unending surge, a flood that swallows the world. In the ancient Near East, the Sumerians told of Ziusudra, a righteous man, warned by a god to build a boat before a deluge came to erase all life. Later, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the character Utnapishtim recounts a similar rescue, surviving with his family and animals to repopulate the land. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah receives instructions to construct an ark, weathering 40 days of rain while the waters rise above the mountains. The Greeks had their own version in Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a flood sent by Zeus by retreating to a small wooden chest and washing ashore on Mount Parnassus. Egypt's own flood myths are quieter, more folded into creation itself. In the Heliopolitan tradition, the god Atum emerges from the primordial waters of Nun, creating the first mound of earth. From there he brings forth the first gods, the sky, the air, and eventually the world. Though the Egyptian myth is more cosmic and symbolic, some scholars have wondered if its imagery, the land rising from endless water, might be a distant echo of an actual inundation, remembered dimly across generations. Such memories could have roots in real events. Around 12,000 years ago, the world was emerging from the last ice age. Vast glaciers melted, releasing torrents of water into the oceans. Global sea levels rose more than 100 meters, drowning coastlines and reshaping continents. One particularly dramatic event, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, raised sea levels several meters in less than a century. Imagine being a coastal or riverine people then. Each year the water creeping farther inland. Villages lost farmland, submerged. If the Nile Delta was already populated in some form, entire settlements could have been erased beneath the rising Mediterranean. Odd fact, deep beneath the waves of the Black Sea, archaeologists have found traces of ancient shorelines and freshwater mollusks buried under layers of saltwater species. This suggests that around 7,500 years ago, the Mediterranean may have broken through the Bosphorus and flooded what was then a large freshwater lake. To the people living there, it would have seemed as though the sea itself had risen overnight. Some even argue this event could have inspired later flood myths. Historians are still debating whether oral traditions can accurately preserve memories of such ancient catastrophes. Linguistic and anthropological studies suggest they can. In Australia, Aboriginal stories describe ancient coastlines and islands that were submerged more than 7,000 years ago. Details that match geological reconstructions. If this is possible there, why not along the Nile? Perhaps the priests of Egypt's earliest temples recited verses about a great flood, not as metaphor, but as history. History that had already slipped so far into the past that it took on the tone of myth. If the pyramids or their earliest foundations predate the Ice Age's end, then their builders might have lived through such a flood. Picture it, standing on the Giza plateau, watching the waters advance year after year, carrying debris from far upstream, swallowing fields and villages. People would have retreated toward higher ground, first to the ridges, then to the hills, and finally to the monuments themselves, the highest and most solid things in the land. For a time, the pyramids might have been islands in a drowned world. Even after the waters receded, the memory of that inundation could have remained, passed down through generations over centuries, as language changed and the specifics blurred. The flood might have taken on a divine quality, a punishment from the gods, or a cosmic reset. Later civilizations might have looked at the ancient stoneworks and assumed they had been built in response to the disaster, perhaps to honor the deities who spared the survivors. Odd fact, some ancient Egyptian temple reliefs show boats large enough to carry multi-ton obelisks along the Nile. These massive barges, built of cedar from Lebanon, were technological marvels in their own right. It's tempting to imagine that even in pre-dynastic times, boat-building traditions could have supported large-scale evacuations or movements of people during great floods. The universality of flood myths suggests that they are more than just human imagination at work. They may be the collective memory of a species that has seen the sea reclaim the land more than once. For the Nile Valley, such a flood could have been both a catastrophe and a turning point, destroying settlements, but also perhaps preserving the largest and most enduring structures by isolating them above the reach of the waters. By the time the Old Kingdom rose, these stories might have been fragments recited in rituals, half believed, but still potent. The pharaohs could have seen themselves as the inheritors of that survival, the rulers of a land reborn from the flood. Whether they knew the true age of the monuments they claimed is uncertain, but the stones would have stood through it all, watching the waters come and go, holding in their silent mass the memory of a world that drowned. Chapter 4. The Green Sahara. Close your eyes and imagine the Sahara not as the endless, heat-shimmering expanse of gold and beige we know today, but as a landscape alive with green. Rivers snake across wide floodplains, their banks shaded by acacia trees. Herds of gazelle and antelope scatter at the approach of human hunters. Crocodiles slide silently through slow-moving water. In the distance, the surface of a great lake glints under the afternoon sun. This is not a fantasy. It is what much of the Sahara looked like for thousands of years during the African humid period, between roughly 14,500 and 5,500 years ago. Subtle changes in the Earth's orbit altered the monsoon patterns of Africa. The rains shifted northward, drenching the Sahara and turning it into a vast savanna. Satellite images today reveal the ghostly traces of ancient rivers and lake beds beneath the sand. Like the veins of a dried leaf, archaeologists working in what is now the deepest desert have uncovered tools, pottery shards, and rock art depicting animals that could never survive there today. Elephants, giraffes, and even hippos. These finds tell us that the Sahara was once home to thriving communities. Odd fact, some of the rock art shows boats, long, sleek vessels with high prows carved into cliff faces, hundreds of miles from any present-day coastline. These are not the papyrus skiffs of the later Nile, but sturdier-looking craft, perhaps designed for river travel or for crossing large lakes. It is a strange, almost haunting image, a fleet of boats sailing across what is now one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. The African humid period would have transformed Egypt's environment as well. The Nile's floodplain would have been lush and expansive, capable of supporting large populations with relative ease. Seasonal floods would have been predictable and generous, replenishing the soil. The desert plateaus, including the Giza Plateau, would have been far less hostile, perhaps dotted with grasses and shrubs, rather than bare rock and drifting sand. If the earliest phases of the pyramids or their foundations were conceived during this green age, their construction would have been far more feasible than in the hyper-arid conditions of later Egypt. Abundant water could have been used, not only for sustaining the workforce, but also for practical purposes, like lubricating sledges carrying heavy stones. Food would have been plentiful, reducing the logistical challenges of feeding thousands of workers. Transporting stone might have been easier too. Boats could have navigated not just the Nile, but the seasonal rivers and lakes that crisscrossed the region. Historians are still debating how quickly the African humid period ended. Some evidence suggests a gradual drying over centuries. Other data points to abrupt shifts, possibly triggered by changes in ocean currents or large-scale climatic events. What is certain is that the Sahara's transformation from green to gold was devastating for the people who lived there. Rivers vanished, lakes shrank into muddy basins, and fertile land turned to dust. Communities would have been forced to migrate, seeking refuge in areas where water still flowed, like the Nile Valley. This migration could have brought skilled builders, craftsmen, and traders into closer contact with those already living along the Nile. They may have carried with them knowledge from other parts of the Green Sahara, techniques for working stone, architectural ideas, or religious symbols. Over time, these influences could have merged with local traditions, giving rise to something entirely new. Odd fact: in southern Egypt's Nabta Playa, archaeologists have found a series of stone circles and alignments dating back at least 7,000 years, possibly earlier. Some of these stones are aligned to mark the summer solstice, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, long before the appearance of written records in Egypt. It is tempting to imagine that such knowledge was part of a broader cultural network spread across the Green Sahara. When the rains finally failed for good, the desert returned with a vengeance. What had been a continent-spanning grassland became a barrier, cutting Egypt off from much of Africa to the west. Trade routes disappeared, and the Green Sahara slipped into memory. But if monumental structures had been built during that earlier age, they would have remained standing on high ground, while the land around them turned to sand. Picture the pyramids, not surrounded by an ocean of desert, but rising from a patchwork of fields, grazing lands, and streams. Imagine their reflection in a pool left by a summer storm, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. This was the world of the Green Sahara, a world that could have nurtured large-scale building projects long before the Old Kingdom pharaohs took the throne. As the centuries passed and the land dried, those monuments would have taken on a different meaning. To later peoples, they might have seemed the work of gods, built in an age when the world was more generous. The memory of the Green Sahara might have been preserved only in stories, half believed. Legends about a time when the desert bloomed, when rivers ran, where now only sand lies. And, like all such stories, they would have carried a warning. Nothing lasts forever, not even the land beneath your feet. If you stand on the Giza plateau at night, far from the glare of modern Cairo, the sky opens like an ancient book. The air cools quickly after sunset, and the horizon takes on that particular velvet darkness, where stars don't just appear, they seem to press forward, closer than you expect. Even now, in a time when city lights have stolen much of the night's brilliance, Orion's belt still hangs clear above the desert, 3 points of light in a perfect line. But thousands of years ago, under skies unpolluted by electric light, the stars would have been so sharp they cast faint shadows on the sand. For people living before the invention of clocks, the night sky was both a map and a calendar. You could tell the time by the positions of certain stars. You could know when to plant crops or prepare for flooding by watching the first pre-dawn rise of a particular constellation. And if you were a builder, someone laying the foundations for a monument meant to last for thousands of years, you might choose to align it with the heavens themselves. The most famous of these ideas is the Orion correlation theory, proposed by Robert Bauval in the 1990s. He noticed that the 3 main pyramids of Giza, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkore, are not perfectly in line, but offset slightly. Just like the stars, Al-Natak, Al-Nilam, and Mintaka in Orion's belt. When he looked at the sky charts, he found that the pyramid's layout matched the stars' positions most closely, around 10,500 BCE. In that same epoch, the constellation of Leo would have been rising directly in the east during the spring equinox, right where the Sphinx gazes eternally. If true, it suggests that the builders might have been commemorating a date thousands of years before the Old Kingdom. Mainstream Egyptology has been skeptical of this theory, pointing out that similar alignments can occur by chance, and that no written records link the pyramids directly to Orion's belt. Yet, even without the Orion theory, the precision of the pyramid's alignment to true north is astonishing. The Great Pyramid's sides are aligned within a fraction of a degree, a feat that would be challenging even with modern surveying equipment. Historians are still debating how the ancient Egyptians achieved this. One plausible method involves watching the simultaneous transit of 2 circumpolar stars, using their crossing point as a fixed reference for true north. But here's the catch. Because of a slow wobble in the Earth's axis known as precession, Those star pairs line up perfectly only at certain times in history. Measurements suggest that the stars best suited for this method would have been aligned several centuries earlier than the accepted construction date of the Great Pyramid. Odd fact: the ancient Egyptians divided the night sky into 36 groups of stars called decans, each rising at a specific time of the year and serving as a kind of stellar clock. Priests could tell the hour during the night simply by looking at which decan had risen above the horizon. This star clock system was so precise it could measure time to within 20 minutes over 1,000 years before mechanical clocks appeared. If a pre-dynastic or even pre-Ice Age culture worked on the Giza Plateau, their relationship to the stars might have been even deeper. Without written language, astronomy might have been a living oral tradition passed from teacher to student. Aligning massive stone structures with celestial markers could serve both as a sacred act and as a practical tool anchoring seasonal calendars, navigation methods, and religious ceremonies to fixed points in the sky. Precession changes the backdrop of the heavens so slowly that a single human lifetime cannot detect it. But over centuries, the shifts become noticeable. Imagine a tradition in which every generation recorded the position of Orion's belt during a specific festival. After many generations, the elders might notice that the stars no longer rose in exactly the same spot. To fix that moment forever, to make sure future generations remembered where the stars once stood, you might decide to record it in stone. The Orion alignment is not the only stellar link proposed for Giza. Some researchers have pointed to the shafts in the Great Pyramid, which appear to be aimed at specific stars. Around 2500 BCE, these would have pointed toward Orion's belt and the star Thuban in the constellation Draco, then the pole star. But if those shafts were aimed in an earlier era, they could have targeted entirely different stars, reflecting a different celestial priority, and perhaps a different culture. Odd fact: many ancient cultures linked Orion with a great hunter or warrior. In Egypt, Orion was associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife and rebirth. Aligning a monument with Orion might therefore have been more than just a technical achievement. It could have been a symbolic connection between the pharaoh and the divine cycle of death and renewal. If the alignment dates to 10,500 BCE, as Boval suggested, the intended symbolism might be even older, perhaps rooted in myths from a time before the Sahara turned to sand. Standing on the plateau, under a clear night sky, you can almost feel the weight of that continuity. The idea that across thousands of years, different peoples stood in the same place, looked up at the same stars, and found meaning there. Whether they were pharaohs, priests, or anonymous stargazers from a forgotten age, the builders of Giza seem to have worked with a cosmic awareness that we are only beginning to rediscover. The stars move slowly, but the stones move even more slowly. Together, they form a dialogue between earth and sky, written in a language we're still learning to read. And if the Giza monuments truly preserve alignments from an older sky, they are not just buildings, they are time capsules, carrying a message from a world whose constellations have shifted, but whose ambition still glitters above us. Chapter 5: The Sea's Memory. If you run your hand over the blocks of the Great Pyramid, you are touching limestone, stone that once lay on the floor of a shallow sea, millions of years before humans appeared. The Giza Plateau itself is part of a vast geological formation laid down in the Eocene epoch, when much of northern Egypt was submerged beneath warm tropical waters. That ancient sea teemed with life: coral reefs, mollusks, fish, and the occasional large marine predator. When the sea receded and the land rose, the sediments hardened into limestone, trapping within them a memory of that ocean world. It's easy to forget when looking at a pyramid that its building blocks are fossils in disguise. tiny shells, and the skeletons of microscopic sea creatures are embedded throughout the stone. If you examine certain blocks closely, especially those taken from deeper layers of the plateau, you can still see the outlines of these fossils, coiled shells, fragments of coral, and even the impressions of ancient sea plants. In some places, the fossils are so dense that the rock looks almost like a solidified shell bed. Odd fact, one of the earliest scientific studies of the Giza stones was not by an Egyptologist, but by a geologist. In the 19th century, travelers noted the presence of fossilized seashells in the pyramid blocks, a discovery that led to early speculation about the ancient environment of the Nile Valley. These observations have since been confirmed repeatedly. The stones of Giza are quite literally the hardened remains of an ancient seabed. For most of the Old Kingdom, this was simply the material at hand, quarried locally and shaped into blocks. But some researchers have noted differences in the composition of certain stones, suggesting that not all of them came from the same quarry. A few blocks, particularly in the pyramid's core, contain marine sediments and fossils not found in the immediate Giza formation. Could this mean that some of the stone was brought from elsewhere? If so, where and why? Historians are still debating the implications. The conventional view is that all the main limestone came from the Giza plateau itself, with harder granite imported from Aswan. But if some of the limestone blocks show different fossil assemblages, it could indicate that older pre-quarried stones from other sites were reused. A possibility that opens the door to the idea that the pyramids incorporated material from earlier, perhaps even much older structures. The seize mark on the stones is not only visible in fossils. Marine sediments leave chemical traces. The composition of certain minerals, the presence of specific isotopes, and the patterns of weathering all hint at their aquatic origins. When rain or wind eats away at the limestone today, it sometimes reveals fresh fossil surfaces, as if the stone is slowly remembering its past life. Imagine this for a moment. The blocks of the pyramids began their journey millions of years ago in the body of a sea creature. That creature lived, died, and sank to the ocean floor, where its remains became part of a growing layer of sediment. Over eons, the sediment compressed into limestone. Then, in some much later age, whether in the Old Kingdom or long before humans, cut it free from the earth and set it in place to form a monument. The journey from seabed to skyline is not just long, it's almost incomprehensibly long. Odd fact, whales once swam where the desert now lies. In Egypt's western desert, at a site called Wadi al-Hitan, Valley of the Whales, archaeologists have uncovered the fossilized skeletons of ancient whales that still bore vestigial hind legs. This was around 40 million years ago, when the Tethys Sea covered much of the region. The same geological processes that created the limestone of Giza shaped the environments where those whales swam. For a pre-Ice Age culture, if such existed in the Nile Valley, these marine fossils might have been more than just stone curiosities. They could have inspired myths, or been seen as signs of an earlier watery world. It's not impossible that ancient builders noticed the shells in their building material and connected them to stories of great floods or primordial seas. Even in later Egypt, the idea of creation emerging from watery chaos was central to religion. The god Atum's first act was to rise from the waters of Nun onto the primeval mound, a motif that resonates strongly with the geological truth beneath Giza. If the pyramids incorporated stone from different locations, some of it could even have come from sites that were themselves much older ruins. In that case, the marine fossils embedded in certain blocks would be a kind of double time capsule. First, a record of a prehistoric ocean. Second, a silent witness to the dismantling and repurposing of earlier structures by later builders. Historians are still debating whether variations in the Giza limestone are simply a result of quarrying different layers on the plateau, or a sign of more complex sourcing. Detailed petrographic studies, the microscopic analysis of rock samples, continue to reveal subtle differences that don't quite fit the simplest models. While these studies are often framed as purely geological, their implications for archaeology are profound. If stone was moved across long distances or across great spans of time, it changes the story of how the pyramids came to be. Next time you see an image of the Great Pyramid, imagine stripping away the layers of history, the weathered surface, the ancient hands that shaped the stone. Imagine the block as it was in its first life, lying under a shallow sea, sunlight filtering down through warm green water. Imagine the slow rain of shells and silt that buried it, the pressure that turned it to stone, and the long, slow uplift that brought it to the surface. In this way, the pyramid is not only a monument to human ambition, it is a monument to the Earth's own deep history. The sea is gone, but its memory remains locked in every block, waiting for the rare person who knows how to read it, and perhaps for those with imagination enough. It whispers a reminder that all land was once sea, and all monuments, no matter how eternal they seem, are built on the bones of forgotten worlds. Stand on the modern shore of the Mediterranean at Alexandria, and you can feel the salt wind on your face, smell the brine, and hear the hiss of waves breaking on stone. But beneath those restless waters lies another Alexandria, an older, sunken city that once bustled with markets, temples, and harbors. Earthquakes, floods, and the slow rising of the sea swallowed it, centuries ago. Divers exploring the bay have found columns, statues, and even massive blocks of quarried stone lying silent in the sand, as if waiting for someone to remember them. The loss of coastal cities is not a uniquely modern phenomenon. The shifting of land and water is as old as civilization itself. The Nile Delta, flat and fertile, has always been vulnerable to the twin forces of the river and the sea. Sediment from the Nile slowly pushes the shoreline outward, but at the same time, storms, floods, and the gradual rise of sea level can reclaim it. Over thousands of years, towns and settlements have appeared, thrived, and then been erased, not only from maps, but from memory. If we think about the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose dramatically, the scale of what may have been lost is staggering. More than 100 meters of sea level rise over several thousand years would have drowned vast stretches of land, including any coastal settlements. In the context of Egypt, that means much of the prehistoric Nile Delta. Any towns, ceremonial sites, or even monumental works that may have existed there could now lie under the Mediterranean, buried under layers of silt. Odd fact, in 2000, underwater archaeologists discovered the lost city of Heraklion, also called Thonis, in Abu Qir Bay, just northeast of Alexandria. Once a thriving port during the late Pharaonic and early Hellenistic periods, it sank about 1,200 years ago, likely due to a combination of earthquakes and liquefaction of the sandy soil. The site contains not only statues and temples, but also docks, anchors, and the remains of wooden ships preserved for centuries under mud. Now, imagine pulling back the water not by 1,200 years, but by 10,000 or more. The shoreline of Egypt would have been far to the north of its present position. The delta would have been larger, with branching channels feeding into wide lagoons and marshes. These would have been perfect places for settlement. Abundant fish, fertile soil, and easy access to river and sea trade routes. If an early advanced culture existed along the Nile, this is where they might have concentrated their efforts. And when the seas rose, those efforts would have been erased. Historians are still debating whether we should expect to find prehistoric monumental architecture underwater. Some argue that if such structures existed, they would have been dismantled by later peoples or destroyed by the forces of erosion and the pounding of waves. Others point out that stone structures can survive remarkably well under the right conditions, especially if they are quickly buried by sediment, as many shipwrecks and ancient harbors have been. In the Mediterranean and beyond, examples abound. Off the coast of Japan's Yonaguni Island, divers discovered stepped stone terraces and sharp-edged platforms lying beneath the waves. Some geologists believe these formations are natural, while others argue they show signs of human modification. If they are man-made, they may date back to a time before rising seas swallowed the site, perhaps during the same post-Ice Age period when, according to some theories, Egypt's earliest monuments could have been built. Near India's Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys have revealed large geometric patterns on the seabed, possibly the remains of ancient structures. And in the Bahamas, the so-called Bimini Road has led some to speculate about sunken prehistoric sites. Whether any of these are truly man-made remains unresolved, but they illustrate how much of our early history could be hidden beneath the waves. Odd fact: sonar mapping of the Nile Delta's underwater shelf has shown buried river channels that no longer exist on land. These submerged rivers may have once been the main branches of the Nile, guiding early settlement patterns. If we could dive along these channels, we might find the remains of villages, or even larger constructions, sealed away from view for thousands of years. If the pyramids' earliest phases predate the end of the Ice Age, their builders could have been part of a larger coastal civilization, one that also built in more vulnerable lowland areas. The great structures at Giza, elevated on a plateau, would have been spared the rising sea, while their sister sites near the coast were lost. In that case, the pyramids might be not only monuments, but survivors, markers left by a culture whose true extent lies drowned and hidden. Standing on the shore today, looking out over the Mediterranean, it's easy to imagine that line of ancient cities stretching into the distance, now erased by the tide. Imagine harbors lined with stone quays, markets filled with the scent of fish and grain, priests offering prayers in temples whose columns now lie scattered on the seabed. Imagine that, somewhere out there, beneath the green water, lies the missing chapter of Egypt's story. A chapter that could explain why the builders of Giza seemed to arrive already knowing how to work in stone on a colossal scale. The ghosts of coastal cities still whisper in the waves. You can't hear the words, but you can feel their weight, especially when you remember that the sea is always hungry and the shore is never still. Chapter 6. Before Writing. We like to imagine history as a neat chronological scroll each year, inked carefully in place, each event written down as it happened. In reality, it's more like a half-burned library with whole shelves missing and others warped by smoke. The written record is patchy at best, and for most of human existence, it simply didn't exist at all. The story of Egypt as told in textbooks begins around 3100 BCE, when Narmer, sometimes called Menes, unified Upper and Lower Egypt. Writing in the form of hieroglyphs appears fully developed not long after. To the casual reader, it might seem as if writing was invented almost overnight, coinciding with the birth of the pharaonic state. But that's the first trap of written history. It makes the arrival of writing look like the arrival of civilization itself, when in fact, it's just the moment a culture becomes visible to us. Odd fact: The earliest preserved shopping list in human history comes not from Egypt, but from Mesopotamia, written on a clay tablet around 3500 BCE. It's a record of deliveries, probably for a temple, listing quantities of beer, bread, and livestock. This mundane inventory survives, while entire oral epics and generations of unwritten history have vanished. Such is the bias of the archaeological record. It preserves the durable and the bureaucratic, while letting the intangible slip away. If the earliest builders at Giza were pre-literate, they would have left no written record of their work. Their tools, clothing, and wooden structures would have decayed. Their language would have died without leaving even a carved sign behind. The Old Kingdom pharaohs inheriting the site could then imprint their own names and stories on the monuments, forever binding them in the eyes of later generations to the dynasties we know. Historians are still debating how long it takes for a writing system to emerge in a complex society. In Egypt, the earliest hieroglyphs appear suddenly and with great sophistication, suggesting a long period of development that is invisible in the archaeological record. It's as if a novel appeared fully formed without any earlier drafts or notes. The same phenomenon is seen in Sumer, where cuneiform emerges in a state so advanced that it must have had precursors we have not yet found. Without writing, a culture must rely on oral tradition to carry its history forward. Oral traditions can be astonishingly resilient. Some Aboriginal stories in Australia appear to describe events from over 7,000 years ago, but they are also vulnerable to distortion. Details blur, dates become symbolic, and events merge with myth. If Egypt inherited oral traditions from an earlier civilization, they may have transformed over millennia into creation myths, god stories, or symbolic tales that only faintly echo the original events. Odd fact, when Napoleon's scholars documented Egypt in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they recorded local traditions claiming that the pyramids were built before the biblical flood. While these stories were dismissed as folklore, they show that even in relatively recent times, there were alternative narratives about the monument's origins circulating among the people who lived in their shadow. The absence of early written records also creates an illusion of sudden brilliance. The Giza pyramids appear in our history books as the work of a society just a few centuries removed from the invention of writing. That makes them seem like a miraculous leap. A culture going from mud brick to the largest stone structures ever built almost instantly. If we allow for the possibility of an earlier, undocumented building tradition, the leap becomes less implausible, but more mysterious. Who were those earlier builders, and why did their other works vanish? Perhaps they built in places now lost beneath the desert sands or the rising Mediterranean. Perhaps they favored materials: wood, plaster, unbaked clay that crumbled away long ago. Or perhaps their monuments still stand in plain sight, reworked and rebranded by later rulers until their original identity is beyond recovery. Writing has a way of solidifying a claim. Once Khufu's name was painted inside the Great Pyramid's hidden chambers, the monument became his in the eyes of history, even though the name might have been added long after the last block was set in place. The earliest written mention of something often becomes, by default, the story of its creation. Without earlier documents to challenge it, the narrative sticks. And so we are left with a paradox. The written record is our most trusted guide to the past, yet it may be the least representative. It preserves a narrow slice of human experience, favoring the literate elite, and the materials that survive Most of what happened before writing is a matter of inference, interpretation, and imagination. For a site like Giza, that means the true story may be far older and far stranger than the neat timeline suggests. If the pyramids truly stand on foundations laid before the invention of writing, they are monuments not only to stonecraft, but to memory itself. Memory that has survived without words, carried instead in the weight of the blocks and the precision of their placement. They remind us that the absence of a written record is not the absence of a story. It's an invitation to look closer, to read the language of the stones, and to imagine the hands that built them, long before anyone thought to carve a name. For as long as humans have stared up at the pyramids, they have wondered who could have built them. For ancient Egyptians of the later dynasties, the answer was not always our ancestors. Some believed the great monuments were the work of beings who came before, giants, demigods, or the mysterious followers of Horus. In the winding corridors of myth, these builders were not ordinary people, but figures larger than life, sometimes literally. The followers of Horus appear in Egyptian king lists as rulers of a semi-mythical era before the unification of Egypt. They are said to have reigned for thousands of years, their names lost, except for fragments preserved in priestly records. Were they symbolic ancestors, legendary culture heroes, or distorted memories of real individuals? Historians are still debating whether such figures were purely mythological or rooted in dimly remembered history. Odd fact, the Palermo stone, an ancient basalt slab containing one of the earliest king lists, includes a section devoted to god-kings who ruled before the first human pharaohs. Their reigns are measured not in decades, but in centuries. While this is clearly not literal in the modern sense, it mirrors other ancient traditions, from the Sumerian king list to biblical genealogies, in which early rulers are given impossibly long lifespans. Such lists may reflect an attempt to compress vast spans of oral tradition into a genealogy, turning generations of leaders into single, long-lived figures. Legends of giants are nearly universal. In some Egyptian tales, the pyramids were attributed to ancient beings of immense size, capable of moving colossal stones with ease. While we can dismiss the literal idea of giant humanoids, the persistence of the motif raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps giants was a metaphor for people whose skills and abilities towered above those of later generations. To a society that had lost certain building techniques, the original builders might have seemed superhuman. And then there are the tools. Archaeological evidence tells us that Old Kingdom Egyptians used copper chisels, dolerite pounders, wooden sledges, and ropes. Experimental reconstructions have shown that these tools can, with enough labor and time, shape limestone blocks and transport them over short distances. But granite basalt and the harder types of limestone used in certain parts of the pyramids present a more difficult challenge. Some blocks in the Great Pyramid's interior are so precisely cut and polished that they fit together with gaps thinner than a sheet of paper. Historians are still debating whether such precision can be achieved solely with the known toolkit of the time. Copper, even when hardened, dulls quickly against granite. Dolerite pounders can break off flakes of stone, but creating flat, polished surfaces and perfectly straight edges that meet at right angles is an entirely different task. Modern engineers who have examined the Great Pyramid's granite beams and sarcophagus-like box in the King's Chamber have sometimes remarked on the difficulty of reproducing such work, without steel tools or high-speed cutting equipment. Odd fact, a handful of stone artifacts from ancient Egypt show concentric spiral grooves inside drilled holes, almost like the thread of a screw. These grooves suggest that a rotating drill bit was used, pressing steadily into the stone. In experimental archaeology, similar marks have been made with copper tube drills and abrasive sand, but the process is extremely slow. To create the same depth and consistency seen in ancient examples would require not just patience, but remarkable control over the drilling process. Some fringe theories suggest the use of lost technologies, perhaps harder metals that have not survived in the archaeological record, or even chemical methods for softening stone. While mainstream archaeology sees no firm evidence for such tools, the sheer skill displayed in the stonework keeps the speculation alive. It is possible that certain techniques, well within the capabilities of ancient craftsmen, have simply not been rediscovered, because the need for them vanished when the monumental building era ended. If an earlier pre-dynastic culture worked at Giza, they might have possessed their own suite of tools and methods, refined over centuries and then lost. The Old Kingdom pharaohs, inheriting their monuments, would have had to adapt their own technology to maintain and expand them. This could explain why some parts of the Giza complex show variations in construction style and precision. Different hands, different tools, possibly even different ages of workmanship layered together. The mythic language of giants and gods may be the cultural echo of this technological layering. To a mason in 2500 BCE, inheriting a flawlessly cut granite block from an earlier age, the unknown maker could easily be elevated to the status of a god. And once you decide the builder was divine, you no longer question how the work was done. It becomes the realm of the sacred, beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. The pyramids thus become palimpsests, not just of stone, but of belief. Beneath the official inscriptions, beneath the pharaoh's name carved into the limestone, there may lie the memory of an older time when the tools were different, the skills sharper, and the builders, whether giants in flesh or giants in craft, left behind works so perfect that later ages could only mythologize them. Chapter 7. The Power Plant Hypothesis. For most people, the pyramids are tombs, grand resting places for pharaohs who saw themselves as gods in human form. This is the story you'll hear in textbooks and museum placards, and it's the story that archaeologists, for the most part, stand by. Yet even in the mainstream, there is an unspoken admission. No pharaoh's body has ever been found inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. In fact, the so-called sarcophagus in the king's chamber is empty, its lid long gone, and there's no sign it was ever sealed with a royal mummy. That vacuum of certainty has invited another story, one far outside the boundaries of orthodox Egyptology. The Giza Power Hypothesis. This speculative idea suggests that the Great Pyramid was not a tomb at all, but some form of machine. Not a whirring, gear-filled contraption, but an architectural device designed to harness, generate, or transmit energy. To be clear, there is no archaeological consensus for this, but the theory persists in part because the pyramid's internal design is so unlike other known burial monuments. Proponents of the hypothesis point to several unusual features. The Grand Gallery, for instance, is a steeply inclined passageway with corbelled walls that soar nearly 8 meters high, far larger than needed for a mere corridor. Its precision is astonishing. The limestone blocks are fitted so tightly that a knife blade can't be inserted between them. The Queen's Chamber, lower in the pyramid, contains 2 small shafts that lead nowhere, blocked by stone doors with copper fittings. Above the king's chamber are 5 massive granite relieving chambers stacked like a layer cake, ostensibly to divert the weight of the stone above. But some speculate they could have served another unknown function. Historians are still debating why the pyramid's builders included these features. The orthodox view is that the shafts may have had symbolic, astronomical alignments, perhaps pointing toward specific stars associated with the afterlife. But alternative theorists suggest they could have been part of a system to channel energy, acoustic, electromagnetic, or even hydraulic. Odd fact: in 2017, researchers using muon radiography, essentially a way of imaging large stone structures using cosmic rays, discovered a previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery. The space is at least 30 meters long and has no known access from existing corridors. While mainstream scholars see it as a relieving chamber or an unfinished space, others speculate it might have been integral to the pyramid's function, whatever that might have been. The power plant version of the hypothesis, popularized by authors like Christopher Dunn, imagines that the pyramid used the natural properties of its limestone and granite to generate vibrations, possibly in resonance with the earth itself. The granite in the king's chamber contains quartz crystals, which can produce an electrical charge when mechanically stressed, a phenomenon known as piezoelectricity. If the chamber was subjected to certain vibrations, these crystals might generate measurable energy. To make the leap from physical possibility to ancient reality is a stretch, but proponents argue that the pyramid's geometry, alignment, and internal structure could have been designed to focus and amplify such vibrations. They note that the monument's base is aligned to true north, with an error of only a few arc minutes, and that its proportions encode mathematical constants like pi and the golden ratio. Whether by design or coincidence remains a matter of fierce debate. If we indulge the idea for a moment, the question becomes, energy for what? Some suggest it could have been a kind of wireless transmission system, echoing the work of Nikola Tesla. Others imagine it was used to power tools, light sources, or even medical devices in a civilization far older than dynastic Egypt. The more cautious speculate it might have been symbolic, a monumental representation of a cosmic principle, using geometry and material properties to harmonize with the universe. It's worth noting that ancient cultures often imbued their monuments with layers of meaning. A temple could be both a place of worship and a political statement. A tomb could be both a burial chamber and a cosmological model. If the Great Pyramid had some secondary function, practical or symbolic, it would not diminish its role as a spiritual focal point. But without definitive evidence, all we can do is map the possibilities. Odd fact: sound behaves strangely in the pyramid's chambers. Visitors to the king's chamber often remark that certain frequencies seem to linger, resonating through the granite in a way that's almost physical. Some musicians have experimented with chanting or playing instruments there, finding that notes around 110 Hz can set up standing waves in the room. Whether this is an intentional feature or a coincidence of architecture is another unanswered question. If an earlier civilization constructed the pyramid, or part of it, before the time of Khufu, and if they possessed a different technological toolkit, then perhaps its purpose was equally different. The Old Kingdom pharaohs may have inherited the structure without fully understanding its original intent, adapting it to their own funerary traditions. Over time, any memory of its other function would have faded, leaving only the stone and the mystery. The Giza power hypothesis may never gain mainstream acceptance, but it serves as a reminder that even the most studied monument on Earth still holds secrets. Whether the pyramid was a tomb, a machine, a star map, or some combination of these. Its endurance across thousands of years speaks to a mastery that still humbles us. It also whispers in the most tantalizing way that the truth might be more complex and more interesting than any single explanation can contain. If the past leaves us clues, then it also leaves us blind spots, great yawning gaps in our understanding, where the evidence has been erased, hidden, or simply overlooked. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Egypt, where thousands of years of shifting sands, rising waters, looting, and urban expansion have conspired to conceal as much history as they have revealed. It's tempting to think of the Giza Plateau as a completely explored site, mapped and measured down to the last stone. In reality, much of it remains unexcavated, buried beneath meters of sand, or lying beneath the sprawl of modern Cairo. Even within the open archaeological zones, there are areas that have barely been touched for decades, simply because funding and resources are limited. This is one of archaeology's greatest limitations. It can only uncover what someone is willing and able to look for. Historians are still debating how many major monuments might lie undiscovered beneath Egypt's deserts. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging have revealed tantalizing shapes, rectangles and lines that could be ancient walls, roads, or foundations. Some are dismissed as natural formations, while others await investigation. But there is no denying that in a country as geologically and culturally layered as Egypt, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Odd fact. In the 1990s, archaeologists conducting a survey near the pyramids found what appeared to be a series of buried boat pits, long, narrow trenches designed to hold ceremonial vessels. One of these, near the Great Pyramid, contained a fully preserved cedar ship, over 4,000 years old. This Khufu ship, now painstakingly reconstructed, had been sealed in its pit and buried under centuries of sand, completely invisible, until modern excavation uncovered it. If an intact ship can remain hidden a few meters from one of the world's most famous monuments, what else might still be out there? The archaeological blind spot extends beyond the desert, into the heart of modern cities. Ancient Memphis, once a bustling capital, lies beneath villages, farmland, and Cairo suburbs. Excavating it fully would require demolishing entire neighborhoods, an impossible proposition. The same is true for many ancient sites in the Nile Delta, where modern settlements sit directly on top of layers of history. We know they're there because occasional construction work exposes pottery shards, walls, or even tombs, only for the finds to be quickly covered again. Urban expansion is not the only obstacle. Some parts of Egypt are off-limits due to political or logistical challenges. Military zones, disputed territories, and inaccessible terrain keep archaeologists from working freely, even when permits are granted. Excavation can be a slow, delicate process, especially when dealing with structures that have been weakened by time or earlier, clumsier digs. Odd fact, in the 20th century, Cairo's sewage system flooded part of the substructure of the Pyramid of Unas, forcing archaeologists to abandon their work there for years. Water and archaeology are uneasy companions. Once moisture seeps into ancient stone or mud brick, the damage can be irreversible. The same slow seepage is at work in other areas, particularly in the Nile Delta, where rising groundwater levels threaten to dissolve or destabilize buried ruins before they can be studied. Then there is the problem of what archaeologists call site bias. funding and interest tend to focus on already famous locations. The Valley of the Kings, Giza, Luxor, while countless smaller sites are neglected. This skews our understanding of history, because the picture we build is based on the most visible and monumental remains, not necessarily the most representative. If Giza appears as a sudden leap into monumental architecture, it might be because we haven't found or haven't looked for the smaller, earlier steps that led to it. Imagine for a moment that an earlier phase of pyramid building took place not at Giza, but in the lowlands of the Nile Delta. Those monuments, perhaps smaller but similar in design, could have been built in a time when the climate was wetter and the land fertile. Then, as the sea rose and the delta shifted, they were lost beneath silt and seawater. Today they would lie dozens of meters below the surface, invisible except to advanced underwater archaeology, and perhaps still centuries away from discovery. Historians are still debating how much weight to give to these missing links in the chain of Egypt's monumental history. For some, the absence of earlier large-scale stonework is proof that the Giza pyramids were unprecedented achievements of the Fourth Dynasty. For others, the lack of evidence simply reflects our limited view, a snapshot taken through the narrow lens of what's been excavated so far. And of course, there is the uncomfortable truth that archaeology is not immune to politics. Certain finds are celebrated, others downplayed, depending on how they fit or fail to fit into the established narrative. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, some discoveries were quietly filed away or forgotten, simply because they raised questions that could not be answered at the time. Today, with more sophisticated tools and global collaboration, those questions might be addressed, but only if someone chooses to look. The archaeological blind spot, then, is not just a gap in the ground, but a gap in our willingness and ability to ask questions. Somewhere under the sand, or under the streets, or under the sea, there may be stones that could shift the entire story of Egypt's past. Until they are found, the Giza Plateau will continue to stand in its strange isolation, a monumental peak in the historical record, with its base hidden deep beneath the dunes. And the water, waiting for the day we learn to see it. Chapter 8. Echoes across the world. Stand before the Great Pyramid, and you may feel it is utterly unique, a singular monument rising from the sands of Egypt. Yet, if you step back and take a wider view of the ancient world, you begin to see faint reflections of Giza's ambitions scattered across the globe. Other places where people long ago shaped stone on a scale that defies easy explanation. These sites, separated by oceans and continents, share certain architectural traits: massive blocks, uncanny precision alignments with the heavens, and a durability that has allowed them to survive for thousands of years. In the high Andes of Bolivia, at a site called Pumapunku, megalithic stonework lies scattered like the bones of a fallen giant. Blocks of andesite, some weighing more than 100 tons, are cut into perfectly straight edges and sharp 90-degree angles. Their surfaces so smooth they almost gleam. Some of the blocks are shaped like giant, interlocking puzzle pieces, as if designed to fit together without mortar. No one knows exactly when Pumapunku was built. Estimates range from around 500 CE to far earlier, possibly predating the Tiwanaku civilization with which it is usually associated. For some researchers, the precision of its stonework echoes the fine joins of Giza's inner chambers. Far to the north in Lebanon, the Roman temple complex at Baalbek sits on a platform that incorporates some of the largest stone blocks ever quarried. 3 of them, known as the Trilithon, each weighing around 800 tons. These colossal blocks are fitted so tightly that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. While the temple above them is Roman, the platform's origins remain murky. Were these stones cut and moved by earlier builders, then repurposed by the Romans? Historians are still debating. But the pattern of later cultures building atop or incorporating older megalithic foundations is one that resonates with the theories about Giza. Og fact: off the coast of Japan, near Yonaguni Island, divers discovered stepped stone terraces and sharp-edged platforms lying beneath the waves. Some geologists believe these formations are natural, while others argue they show signs of human modification. If they are man-made, they may date back to a time before rising seas swallowed the site. Perhaps during the same post-Ice Age period, when, according to some theories, Egypt's earliest monuments could have been built. On the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia lies Nan Madol, a city built on a series of artificial islets connected by canals and made of massive basalt columns. The builders somehow transported and stacked these stone logs, some weighing several tons, without the benefit of cranes or wheels. Like Giza, Nan Madol's layout seems to follow a carefully planned geometry. And like Giza, its origin stories are tangled in myth. Local legends speak of powerful brothers who summoned the stones with magic, a poetic echo of Egypt's followers of Horus, or the mythical giants. Credited with building the pyramids, historians are still debating whether these similarities are evidence of a shared ancient knowledge or simply parallel evolution. Different cultures faced with similar challenges, arriving at similar solutions. Mainstream archaeology leans toward the latter, yet the idea of a faint, long-forgotten connection appeals to the imagination. Could there have been a network of knowledge in prehistory, a way for ideas about working in stone to travel vast distances? Odd fact: megalithic structures often align with astronomical events, even when built oceans apart. Stonehenge in England marks the summer and winter solstices with its massive sarsen stones. The Temple of Menidra in Malta is aligned so that sunlight at the equinox illuminates its central doorway. The pyramids of Giza align to true north with remarkable precision. While this may partly be explained by the universal human fascination with the sky, the technical skill required to achieve such alignment suggests a level of shared intent, if not direct communication. When you begin to see Giza as part of this global pattern, it changes the way you think about it. The pyramids are no longer an isolated wonder, but one note in a chorus of megalithic achievements, a chorus that spans continents and millennia. Some notes are louder than others, some clearer, but all seem to hum with the same questions. How did they do this? Why did they build on such a scale? And why has so much of the knowledge behind it been lost? If Egypt's great monuments are indeed the product of an older, pre-dynastic culture, then they may share more than just superficial traits with these distant sites. Perhaps they share a deeper lineage of ideas about permanence, the cosmos, and humanity's place within it. Or perhaps they are the independent expressions of something universal in us. The urge to build in stone, to reach for the stars, to leave behind something that will outlast us. Standing at Giza, you can feel that echo. You can imagine it resonating outward across time and space, touching Pumapunku, Baalbek, Stonehenge, Nan Madol, and Yonaguni. Whether these connections are real or imagined, they remind us that the ancient world was far larger, stranger, and more interconnected, if only in spirit, than we often give it credit for. History tends to favor the idea that civilizations collapse slowly, gradually, losing their strength through political decay, economic trouble, or invasion. But there are moments when the Earth itself delivers a far more decisive verdict. When climate shifts, not over centuries, but in the space of a human lifetime, forcing entire cultures to vanish or transform almost overnight. If you picture an ancient civilization, perhaps one capable of building on the scale of the pyramids, living on the margins of the Nile, thousands of years before the first pharaoh, you must also picture them living under the shadow of a volatile climate. One of the most striking examples of such a shift is the Younger Dryas, a sudden cooling event that began around 12,900 years ago, just as the planet was warming. At the end of the last ice age, global temperatures plunged again, and for more than 1,000 years, ice age conditions returned to much of the northern hemisphere. This was not a minor blip. It changed rainfall patterns, disrupted ecosystems, and in some areas brought agriculture to a standstill. In the Middle East's Fertile Crescent, where some of the first farming communities were taking root, it forced people to abandon settlements and revert to more mobile lifestyles. Historians are still debating what caused the Younger Dryas. Some theories point to the sudden release of meltwater from North American ice sheets into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents. Others suggest a comet or asteroid impact. Based on layers of microscopic glassy spherules and elevated platinum found at sites across multiple continents, whatever the cause, the effect was the same. Rapid, global-scale disruption that would have been devastating for any complex society dependent on stable weather patterns. Odd fact, in Greenland ice cores, the onset of the Younger Dryas is marked by a temperature drop of around 8 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees Fahrenheit, in just a few decades. A change so fast that it would have been noticeable within a single human lifetime. Imagine being a farmer or builder in that time, watching the climate shift so quickly that the rhythms of planting and harvest no longer made sense. If a pyramid-building culture had existed along the Nile before the Younger Dryas, this climate shock could have fractured it completely. Seasonal floods might have failed, food production could have collapsed, and populations might have splintered into smaller, scattered groups. The knowledge and organization needed to sustain monumental construction could have been lost in a single generation. The structures themselves might remain, but their creators' names, language, and purpose would be swallowed by time. And then there is the African humid period, which followed soon after. Beginning around 14,500 years ago and lasting until roughly 5,500 years ago. It turned the Sahara into a green landscape of lakes and rivers. For a time, this would have been a golden age for life in North Africa. Ample water, fertile land, and abundant wildlife. But its end was brutal. Within a few centuries, perhaps less rainfall patterns shifted again, and the Sahara transformed from savanna to desert. This desertification was so rapid that even the most adaptable cultures would have struggled to survive. We see its fingerprints in the archaeological record. Rock art from the central Sahara depicts giraffes, elephants, and hippos, animals that require significant water sources. These images vanish as the desert expands. Communities that had thrived in green valleys and around large lakes either migrated toward the Nile or disappeared entirely. If monumental sites existed in the Sahara during its green phase, most would now be buried under dunes or eroded to nothing. Odd fact, in Chad's Enedi region, archaeologists have found stone monuments and burial mounds dating back more than 7,000 years, now isolated in one of the driest places on Earth. These remnants suggest that complex societies once flourished deep within what is now uninhabitable desert. climate can erase in subtler ways too. Along the Nile, rising or falling water levels can bury sites under layers of silt or wash them away entirely. Over thousands of years, the river's course has shifted repeatedly, sometimes by kilometers, meaning that ancient settlements might lie beneath farmland or in places where no one would think to dig. In the delta, the combination of sea level rise and sedimentation creates a constantly changing landscape, one that could easily hide evidence of early cultures. For millennia, historians are still debating whether the loss of these potential sites is the main reason we see what appears to be a sudden start to Egyptian monumental building in the Old Kingdom. Is it truly a beginning? Or is it merely the first surviving chapter after several others were erased? The idea that climate can erase civilizations is not confined to prehistory. Even in more recent times, prolonged droughts have brought empires to their knees. The collapse of the Mayan cities in the 9th century CE is often linked to severe extended drought. The disappearance of the ancestral Puebloans from Chaco Canyon in the 12th century may have had similar causes. These examples remind us that complex societies are not immune to nature's whims, and that their most impressive achievements can outlast their creators, leaving us to guess at their origins. If the Giza pyramids are survivors from an earlier epoch, then they are more than monuments. They are climate refugees. They stand on high, dry ground above the reach of floods, beyond the shifting course of the Nile, and in a place where sand, while burying much, also preserves. The culture that built them may have been swept away by a sudden shift in wind and water, but the stone endured, waiting for the next civilization to find it, repurpose it, and call it their own. In this way, the climate that erased might also have been the climate that preserved, wiping away all but the largest, most immovable traces of an older world, so that what we see today are the peaks of a mountain range whose foothills lie hidden, long, drowned, or buried in the sands. Chapter 9. The Silence, the Bones. If an ancient advanced culture truly thrived along the Nile before the Ice Age's end, and perhaps even raised the earliest forms of the pyramids, then we face an unsettling question. Where are their dead? Every known civilization leaves behind burials, bones, grave goods, traces of ritual. And yet, if such a pre-dynastic pyramid culture existed, its people seem to have slipped from history without leaving a cemetery behind. It is this absence, this silence of the bones, that makes some scholars reluctant to consider the idea at all. The absence could be an illusion. Human remains are fragile things, far more perishable than stone. In humid or wet environments, bones can decay completely within centuries. Even in dry regions, they can crumble if not protected. In many parts of the Nile Valley, the water table has shifted dramatically over the last 10,000 years, drowning what might once have been graves. In other areas, wind-driven sand has eroded surfaces, repeatedly exposing bones to the sun and scattering them until they vanish into dust. Odd fact, in the hyper-arid Atacama Desert in Chile, mummies over 7,000 years old survive intact. Yet just a few hundred kilometers away, in slightly less dry conditions, human remains from the same period are entirely absent. Preservation is a lottery, and climate is only one of the players. Historians are still debating whether the absence of bones necessarily means an absence of people. In some ancient cultures, elaborate burial rituals involved cremation, which destroys skeletal remains entirely. Others practiced forms of sky burial, leaving the dead to be consumed by animals and the elements. If our hypothetical pre-Ice Age Nile culture followed such practices, they could have left behind little to no physical evidence. Then there is the possibility of relocation. If climate change forced a mass migration, the bulk of the population might have left the Nile Valley entirely. In such a case, any burial grounds they left behind could be far from the monumental centers, hidden in regions we have not yet explored, or beneath landscapes now inaccessible. And we must remember that much of the archaeological record is filtered through the accidents of discovery. Most excavations in Egypt have been concentrated in areas associated with known dynastic sites. The further back we go, the less targeted our searches become. Without inscriptions or recognizable artifacts to mark a burial as significant, early remains might have been overlooked, misidentified, or even discarded by earlier generations of diggers. Odd fact: in the 19th century, many tombs uncovered by Egyptian workers were emptied of bones without any formal record, because antiquities dealers valued the grave goods, but not the human remains. This loss means we will never know the age, health, or genetic background of those individuals. Another layer of difficulty comes from the fragility of ancient DNA. The hot Egyptian climate degrades genetic material rapidly, leaving only the most sheltered and carefully preserved specimens suitable for analysis. Even when remains are found, they may yield no recoverable genetic information. Without DNA linking any individual to a hypothetical earlier population becomes a matter of educated guesswork, relying on skull shape or bone measurements, methods far less precise than modern genetics. Historians are still debating whether the genetic evidence we do have supports continuity or change in the Nile Valley's population over the last 10,000 years. Some studies suggest a relatively stable core population with outside influences over time. Others propose more dramatic population shifts. But given the fragmentary nature of the data, it is possible that a small, earlier population could vanish from the record entirely, replaced or absorbed by later arrivals. There is also a cultural angle to consider. Later dynastic Egyptians placed enormous emphasis on preserving the body for the afterlife, leading to the famous practice of mummification. But earlier cultures may have viewed death differently, leaving no monumental tombs or preserved remains. If their dead were placed in simple, unmarked graves exposed to the elements or interred in now lost floodplains, the passage of thousands of years would wipe the slate clean. It is even possible that the builders themselves left intentionally few traces. Nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples can achieve remarkable feats of construction. Consider the great stone circles of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built by hunter-gatherers more than 11,000 years ago. They left behind intricate stonework, but almost no permanent settlements and very few burials. A pyramid-building culture could have operated in a similar way, gathering seasonally for construction before dispersing again. Such a pattern would leave a monumental footprint, but a faint human one. The silence of the bones is unsettling, because we expect to hear them speak. We want skeletal remains to tell us who these people were, where they came from, and what became of them. But silence, too, can tell a story. It may hint at rituals and beliefs we cannot guess. It may point to climate forces that scattered or destroyed. Or it may simply remind us that the human record is far more fragile than the stone one. If the pyramids are the last voices of an older culture, then their builders' bones may have been claimed by the Nile, the sand, or the wind, long before the first pharaoh walked the plateau. We stand in their shadows, hearing nothing but the hum of history in the stone. And sometimes, silence speaks loudest of all. If there truly was a culture along the Nile before the dawn of the pharaohs, one capable of raising the first forms of the pyramids, then they must have spoken, sung, argued, prayed. They must have had words for their tools, their gods, their fears. Yet if they left a language behind, it has vanished as thoroughly as their bones. What remains instead is an echo, faint and distorted, perhaps hidden within the earliest layers of Egyptian myth and writing, or buried in place names whose meanings have long since been forgotten. Language is one of the first casualties of time. It is also one of the most mutable things humans create. When people migrate, they blend their speech with that of others, and in just a few centuries, the original words can become unrecognizable. If an Ice Age Nile culture was replaced or absorbed by later settlers, their vocabulary could have dissolved into the evolving river of Egyptian speech, leaving only isolated fossil words behind. Historians are still debating whether traces of such an older tongue survive in the Egyptian language as we know it. Ancient Egyptian itself, first attested in writing around 5,000 years ago, belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family. It shares certain features with Berber-Semitic and Chadic languages, suggesting deep prehistoric connections across North Africa and the Middle East. But within its oldest inscriptions are words that resist clear comparison. Odd, archaic terms whose origins are unclear. Some linguists think these may be remnants of a substrate language, spoken before Egyptian fully emerged. Odd fact, in modern Egypt, some Nile place names cannot be explained through Arabic or Coptic, the later descendant of ancient Egyptian. They may be linguistic fossils handed down over thousands of years from cultures long erased. Place names are remarkably durable. They can survive even when their original meanings are forgotten. The Nile itself might once have been called something entirely different by a people whose words have not been spoken aloud for millennia. If the builders of the pyramids or their precursors left no written records, we can only imagine what their script might have looked like. Early dynastic hieroglyphs already display a high level of sophistication, as if writing emerged fully formed. This has puzzled scholars, because writing systems elsewhere, such as Sumerian cuneiform, show clear stages of development, from simple pictographs to complex scripts. In Egypt, the missing earlier stages could mean either that they have been lost, or that writing was introduced suddenly, perhaps adapted from an older system now vanished. It is not impossible to think that the earliest hieroglyphic signs were inspired by symbolic carvings made by an earlier people. Rock art in the Eastern Desert and Western Desert, some dating back over 7,000 years, shows animals, boats, and human figures in stylized forms. While not writing in the formal sense, these images could have served as a symbolic language, a way to communicate ideas across time and space. Historians are still debating whether the myths preserved in later Egyptian religion might be retellings, however distorted, of events or beliefs from this deeper past. Stories of Zep-Tepi, the first time, describe an age when gods walked among men and established the order of the world. Some interpret this as pure mythology, while others see it as a poetic memory of an earlier, perhaps more advanced age, later reframed in divine terms. Odd fact, in some creation myths, the god Thoth is credited with inventing writing, not for humans, but for the gods themselves, implying that knowledge of writing was something handed down rather than invented from scratch. The loss of language is more than the loss of words. It is the loss of thought patterns, metaphors, and ways of seeing the world. If we could hear the speech of this hypothetical earlier Nile culture, it might reveal how they conceived of time, how they understood the stars, how they named the great stone shapes rising from the earth. Without it, we are left with mute architecture and the interpretations of those who came later. It is possible that somewhere deep in the desert or hidden in a sealed chamber, A few lines of an older script still exist, waiting to be found. A carved stone, a painted wall, a fragment of an idea that survived the millennia. But until then, the language remains in the realm of ghosts. The pyramids may speak in their own way through geometry and proportion, but they do not tell us what their builders called them or themselves. To imagine the language that was lost is to feel a kind of vertigo, as if standing at the edge of a vast silence. We can look into it, send our questions echoing out, but the answers do not return. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery. How something as mighty as a culture's voice can disappear so completely, leaving behind only the cold certainty of stone. Stone does not speak in words, but it remembers. In its layers, its fractures, its weathering, there are traces of everything it has endured. If the pyramids, or at least their cores, were built before the Ice Age ended, the stones themselves may hold the quiet proof. You only have to know how to listen. Much of the Great Pyramid's bulk is made from local limestone quarried right on the Giza Plateau. Limestone is a sedimentary rock born in shallow seas millions of years ago. Embedded within it are the shells of ancient marine life, visible even in the blocks of the pyramid if you look closely. These fossils tell a story that stretches far deeper in time than humanity. But the real question isn't about when the stone formed. It's about when it was cut, moved, and set in place. Historians are still debating whether the weathering patterns on some pyramid blocks and nearby structures, such as the Sphinx enclosure, are consistent with the hyper-arid climate of the last 4,500 years, or with an earlier, wetter period in Egyptian prehistory. Proponents of the older Sphinx theory point to deep vertical fissures and rounded edges on the limestone walls, features that can be caused by prolonged rainfall. Critics argue that wind and salt crystallization could produce similar effects. Yet if the weathering truly is rain-induced, it would imply exposure during the African humid period or even earlier times when the climate was far wetter than today. Odd fact, under a microscope, stone surfaces can reveal tiny mineral deposits formed by water percolating through them. These mineral patterns can be dated, offering a rough idea of when a surface was last exposed. In theory, if certain pyramid stones were found to have such ancient patinas beneath later surface layers, it might suggest they were reused from older structures. The granite blocks used in the King's Chamber and elsewhere in the pyramid were brought from Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers to the south. Moving them would have been an enormous undertaking, even for the dynastic Egyptians. If these blocks were quarried and transported in an earlier era, perhaps during a time when Nile floodwaters were higher or channels different, their journey might have been easier. But their survival into later construction would suggest a tradition of reusing sacred or valuable stone. Historians are still debating whether tool marks on certain blocks indicate copper chisels, harder stone pounders, or something else entirely. On some granite surfaces, microscopic grooves appear too fine and consistent to have been made with the most basic tools. They could be the result of abrasion with sand and harder minerals over time, or they could hint at techniques we no longer recognize. Odd fact, archaeologists studying ancient quarries sometimes find unfinished blocks still attached to bedrock with wedge holes and channels showing the exact moment work stopped. If similar unfinished blocks were ever found at Giza and dated conclusively to before the Old Kingdom, it would be a seismic shift in how we view the pyramid's origins. There's also the question of the mortar. The pyramid's builders used a gypsum-based mortar that has survived remarkably well. Chemical analysis shows it contains not only local materials, but also microfossils and mineral traces from distant sources. The formula might hold clues to the era in which it was made. If the oldest mortar samples predate the 4,500-year mark, it would be compelling evidence that at least part of the pyramid structure is older than the conventional timeline. Stone can also preserve unexpected clues, tiny bits of charcoal, plant fibers, or even insect remains. Trapped during construction, in rare cases, such inclusions have been radiocarbon dated, offering a glimpse into the exact time they were embedded. A few such tests on pyramid mortar have returned surprisingly early dates, though these results are often contested, with some scientists suggesting contamination by older material. Odd fact: laser scanning of ancient stone surfaces can reveal microtopography, minute ridges and depressions invisible to the naked eye that can be compared to erosion models to estimate exposure time. In other words, by reading the skin of the stone, researchers might one day pinpoint how long it has stood under sun and wind. The pyramids may never yield a single, undeniable smoking gun that proves their Ice Age origins, but they are not mute. Their very mass means they have endured far more than any written record could. Every grain of sand that has abraded their surface, every drop of rain that has streaked their sides, has left its mark. In this way, the stones are not simply building material. They are archives, layered with a history that runs deeper than the civilizations that claimed them. To stand close to one of these blocks, to trace the chisel marks or the weathered edges with your fingertips, is to touch something that has lived through epochs. Empires have risen and fallen in the time it has been in place. If the pyramids were born before the Ice Age ended, then they have outlasted climates, languages, and entire peoples. They have seen green savannas turn to desert, and rivers shift their courses. They remember it all, even if they cannot tell us outright. The challenge is finding the key, the method of listening that will turn their silent memory into a story. And perhaps, one day, when the right science meets the right curiosity, the stones will finally whisper the truth. Chapter 10. The Last Night. The wind on the Giza plateau changes after sunset. It becomes softer, almost hesitant, as though aware it is brushing against something older than night itself. The city lights in the distance flicker like a mirage. But here among the stone giants, time feels different. If the pyramids were truly raised before the Ice Age ended, then this place has seen nights far darker than any modern visitor will ever know. Nights when no city burned on the horizon, when the only glow came from the moon, and the air carried the scent of a green Nile valley stretching into the unknown. You can almost imagine the last night of that earlier civilization, if it ever existed. The builders, whether they were a great city's laborers or a scattered people who gathered seasonally, might have stood here in silence, aware that something was ending. Perhaps the sky had already begun to change. Perhaps the seasons had turned unpredictable. The rains might have failed. The rivers begun to retreat. A shiver of cold creeping down from the north, or the slow tightening of drought from the south, could have been enough to warn them that the world they knew was slipping away. Historians are still debating whether ancient oral traditions preserve memories of such endings, great floods, famines, or celestial events. In many cultures, myths describe the gods withdrawing, or the world being remade after catastrophe. Were these stories just allegories? Or did they begin as eyewitness accounts of the earth itself shifting beneath a people's feet? Odd fact, the oldest known lunar calendar etched into a bone found in Africa more than 20,000 years ago suggests that humans were tracking the heavens long before agriculture. A culture capable of aligning the pyramids so precisely with the cardinal points would have been deeply aware of the sky. If a night came when the stars no longer rose where they once did, they would have noticed. They might even have read it as a warning. Perhaps on that last night, the pyramid's base was still surrounded by tools, ramps, and half-finished stones. Perhaps fires burned in nearby encampments, their smoke drifting upward in the cooling air. Somewhere an elder might have been telling a younger listener what to remember, what to carry forward, if the people had to scatter. Words passed in the dark, knowing the stone would remain behind, silent and immovable, when all else was gone. The next morning could have brought the first steps of abandonment, a migration toward water, the slow decay of once busy paths, the burying of ramps in drifting sand. And with each passing season, the plateau would have grown quieter, until only the wind remained to circle the structures. If this imagined ending happened, it would not have been sudden in the way disasters are today. It would have been stretched across years, even decades, giving just enough time for the builders' children to remember the stones, but perhaps not their purpose. Give it a few more generations, and those stones would become the work of the ancestors, and then the work of the gods. By the time the first pharaohs rose, the true origin could already have been lost to memory, replaced by myth. Odd fact, in some desert regions, even large man-made structures can vanish entirely beneath dunes in less than a century, only to be revealed again hundreds of years later. If parts of Giza were ever buried and then re-exposed, that cycle could have helped preserve them through the chaos of changing ages. Standing on the plateau today, you might think that the pyramids are eternal. But even stone erodes, sand grinds, the desert takes back what is hers. One day, far in the future, these shapes may be worn down to little more than mounds, their sharp edges long gone. Whoever walks here then, if anyone, may look at them with the same puzzled wonder we feel now, and wonder about a civilization they can no longer see. If the pyramids truly predate the Ice Age, then tonight is just another in a chain of millions of nights they have endured. Your footsteps on the sand are one more sound in their long memory. The wind moves around them like breath over the lips of a sleeping giant. And the stars, those same stars their builders once charted, still pass overhead in silence. You leave the plateau knowing that you will never know everything, and perhaps that is the point. The stone doesn't need to explain itself. It was here before you were born. It will be here long after you're gone. Some questions are meant to stay open, so that every time you ask them, you feel the same shiver of wonder. The night air on the plateau cools slowly, as if reluctant to let go of the heat it gathered under the sun. The sand shifts just enough to remind you it is alive, moving grain by grain, even when the world feels still. Above, the stars hold their places, but you know they too are drifting, very slowly, in arcs you will never live to see completed. And there at the edge of your vision, the pyramids rise, as they have for thousands of nights, holding their silence, asking nothing, answering less. You might try to imagine all the people who have stood here before you. Farmers from the valley who came to watch the setting sun. priests from a later age who offered incense to gods whose names had already changed, foreign soldiers whose boots crunched the same sand, and who for a moment might have looked up and felt the same strange stillness. And maybe long before them, all are different people entirely. People whose faces and voices are gone, but whose hands shape the stones in ways we still do not fully understand. It is tempting to want the truth, to demand an answer from the past. But the pyramids do not yield easily. They keep their secrets with the patience of mountains. And perhaps that is the lesson they offer. That not knowing can be its own kind of knowledge. That a mystery kept alive keeps us alive too. So tonight, as you let your thoughts drift, picture the plateau not as it is now, but as it might have been. Green, alive, echoing with voices in a language no one speaks anymore. Let that image fade slowly, like the last glow of firelight, until only the shape of the stone remains, and beyond it, the quiet of the desert. Imagine the people who built these monuments, not as gods or giants, but as humans, like you, driven by the same impulse that has always driven us. The need to create something that will outlast our brief time here. The need to speak across the ages, even if we cannot know who will listen. They succeeded in ways they could never have imagined. Their names are lost, their language forgotten, their bones returned to dust. But the stones remain, and in remaining, they have become something more than tombs or temples or markers of royal power. They have become a question posed to every generation that follows, a question about what we are capable of, what we have forgotten, and what we might still discover if we are willing to look closely enough. The pyramids ask us to consider that history is not a straight line, moving from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced, but a landscape full of peaks and valleys, where knowledge can be gained and lost, and gained again. They remind us that the past is not as distant or as different as we like to think, that the people who moved these stones felt the same sun on their faces, the same wind in their hair, the same pull of the stars overhead. They loved and feared and dreamed just as we do. And somewhere in the geometry of their greatest work, they left a message, not in words, but in stone itself. A message that says, "We were here. We built this. Remember us." And we do remember, even if we cannot remember everything. We stand in the shadow of their achievement and feel something stir in us. A recognition, perhaps, that we are part of the same long story, that the question they asked with their monuments is the same question we ask with ours. What will remain when we are gone? What mark will we leave on the world? What voice will echo into the future? The pyramids have no answer for this, because they are the answer. They are proof that even in silence, even across unimaginable spans of time, a voice can still be heard. A hand can still be felt. A question can still resonate. Tonight, the stars are the same stars that shone on the builders, whether they worked 4,000 years ago or 14,000. The moon rises over the desert as it always has, casting long shadows across the sand. And the pyramids stand as they have always stood, patient, silent, eternal. They do not need us to understand them. They do not need us to solve their mysteries. They simply are. And in their being, they offer us something precious. A sense of continuity, a thread connecting us to the deepest roots of human ambition and creativity. They remind us that we are not the first to look up at the night sky and wonder, not the first to shape stone with our hands, not the first to dream of permanence in an impermanent world. And we will not be the last. The wind picks up slightly, carrying with it the scent of distant places, perhaps a hint of the sea to the north, or the deeper desert to the west. You take one last look at the pyramids, their edges softened by darkness, their bulk somehow both reassuring and mysterious. And then you turn to leave, carrying with you not answers, but something better. A sense of wonder that will stay with you long after this night has ended. A reminder that some of the best questions are the ones that cannot be fully answered. That some of the greatest achievements are the ones that continue to puzzle and inspire us centuries after their creators have vanished. The pyramids will be here tomorrow, and the day after, and 1,000 years from now, they will outlast us all. And that is exactly as it should be.
They are not meant to be solved, but to be wondered at. Not meant to be conquered, but to be respected.
They are monuments not just to the people who built them, but to the enduring human spirit that refuses to be forgotten, that insists on leaving a mark, no matter how impossible the task may seem. And as you walk away into the Egyptian night, you carry that spirit with you, knowing that somewhere in your own life, you too will build something that matters, something that in its own small way reaches toward the eternal. And perhaps that is the real gift the pyramids offer us. Not the answer to when or how or why they were built, but the inspiration to build something ourselves, to leave our own mark on the world, to add our own voice to the great chorus of human achievement that echoes across the centuries. From the first stone placed on the Giza plateau, to whatever monument someone will raise 1,000 years from now, we are all part of the same story, all reaching for the same stars, all hoping that something of what we create will endure. And in that hope, in that reaching, we become connected to every human who came before us, and every human who will come after. The pyramids stand as proof that this is possible, that stone can outlast flesh, that a voice can echo across millennia, that a question once asked can never truly be silenced. And so we leave them there in the desert, under the stars, keeping their secrets and their promises, waiting patiently for the next person to stand before them and wonder, waiting for you to return someday and ask again the questions that have no easy answers, waiting as they have always waited, with the infinite patience of stone and the quiet confidence of something that knows it will outlast everything, including our need to understand it completely. Good night.